Welcome everyone to the League of Women Voters Empowering You. This series program is designed by the League of Women Voters in partnership with Dayton Access Television to provide unbiased, nonpartisan information on issues that are relevant to our friends and neighbors throughout the greater Dayton area. The League of Women Voters' mission focuses as much on education as it does on voting and on issues of policy related to government, social policy, and natural resources. My name is David Bodary. I'm a member of the League of Women Voters and your host as we discuss tonight's topic, which I think is really important, the impact of dark money on our elections. Our guest today is Dr. Staci Rhine. She is a professor of political science at Wittenberg University. She teaches political science courses at Wittenberg, ranging from a freshman American government course to more advanced courses in political parties and interest groups. So Dr. Rhine, welcome. We know that you've got a PhD from The Ohio State University in political science, and we really look forward to learning more about your perspective on really how dark money is influencing our elections. Obviously, you've got a little more background than that, and I'm happy if you would share a little bit about what it is that you like about what you do as a political scientist.
Oh, what I like making politics accessible to students, and some of the themes are, lots of people think politics doesn't matter in my life, and so one of the themes I try to do is we're all affected by politics, and the policy and the choices. Just today, I taught an introduction to American national government class, and we were talking briefly about the earthquakes in Turkey and Syria and about building codes.
Right.
And you don't think about it until your house collapses, but where you live is shaped by the rules and policies, and is it safe? And are building codes upheld so that you don't die? So how do politics, most people think it doesn't affect my life, and it really affects everyone's lives. And so try to make those connections about how it affects you.
That's really a great connection, and actually relates in some ways to some of the things I was thinking about. We had a recent train derailment in Northeast Ohio, and you could argue that that also was influenced by politics. But let's first kind of get talking about this issue of dark money and really begin at perhaps the beginning. Obviously, elections for years have been influenced by money. So this issue of dark money is only a variation of a problem that has existed for a long time. Are there examples that you talk about of the influence of money in politics?
Mm-hmm. Well, first I want to think about money as being on a continuum. So from one end is money that is fully reported. You know who's giving it. You know what they do for a living. You know what candidates are getting that money. And you can only give in relatively small amounts. It would be big to us, but small compared to what we're going to talk about, dark money. And then along the way, you have starting to get a little darker, say super PACs, that they do have to report. It's not quite as clear as the small things here, and they're not coordinated with campaigns, but there is some reporting there. So you can find out where it is. And then all the way down here, which we call the darker money, is huge sums of money, also like super PACs in the middle, but really hard to trace. And so we have estimates even for dark money, but we're not sure who's giving it. We're not sure. For example, it's possible that foreign money could be filtered through different shell companies and stuff. So if you think of a continuum down here at the dark money, we're not really sure who's giving it, and it's illegal for foreign individuals, but it's really hard to trace down at this end. So you think about it as on that continuum, in the middle and dark here are just really huge sums of money that aren't going to campaigns, but are outside spending of enormous sums.
That analogy, that continuum, is really helpful. So I can make a personal donation to a candidate, but that money would be trackable. In other words, my $25 check that I give to whoever I might prefer would be able to be tracked, and they would say, okay, we know that David made this contribution of $25. But as we get to the other end of the spectrum, then that continuum, perhaps larger sums of money and, more importantly, non-trackable sums of money might appear in support of a candidate. And I know over time we've created rules to try to control some of that. I'm not sure that we have time to get into all of that, but I did do a little research and I found out that, at least in George Washington's day, it would be embarrassing to ask for money. And so Washington himself probably funded whatever effort or campaign he might have had in that very first election. And at least in my research, it wasn't until I think it was Andrew Jackson, who was of less means, that he began to then fundraise. And of course, then you have to figure out ways to get people to give you things. So it's interesting. Money in politics isn't brand new, but it's becoming more complicated. Certainly, the recent Supreme Court decision regarding Citizens United has had an influence on that. Can you explain what Citizens United was about?
Okay, so it's Citizens United and a series of other rulings. So outside groups could, what we call independent spending cannot be coordinated with a candidate. And that did exist before Citizens United. But until Citizens United, corporations couldn't give money out of their treasuries. People who work for a corporation could give money to a PAC, say, or a union could give money to a PAC, but it couldn't come out of their treasuries. And with Citizens United, now you can take money out of the treasury of unlimited amounts to spend in this outside spending. And so it has this potential to open up. So there's huge sums of money pour into politics, both for corporations, but the real increase has been by billionaires. Billionaires have poured huge sums of money in. And so the amount of spending increase so far exceeds the rate of inflation. So elections have got enormously more expensive with all of this outside money pouring in. And what's interesting is it shifts, you want to also be sympathetic to candidates here, because candidates can only raise money in relatively small amounts. And you could give 10 million to an outside group to run against a candidate and run ads against them. And so it also shifts some of that power away from candidates, but also parties. If you think about the role of parties, you imagine parties structuring elections, but you have this, dark money group that might spend $100 million, far exceeding what a party's going to be able to spend. And so it's also huge sums of money, difficult to trace, but probably is shifting some power too.
Can you explain more about that? Like, what is the impact on our democracy from that perspective of shifting the power?
Well, think about if you're a candidate and let's say you can raise $500,000 for a house race, and someone can come in and threaten to spend $20 million against you. Think about that position that it puts candidates in that cannot possibly raise that amount of money because they raise in small increments. So, yeah, it shifts that power dramatically.
And so, I could imagine that could also influence people's behavior in terms of feeling, and I want to be careful of the words I guess I choose, but to feel like they need to have that money, and then how do they respond when it becomes sort of so difficult to raise the money, but then, or difficult to overcome the money that's raised against you?
Or let's even say they're not going to campaign on behalf of you, but you don't want to alienate an economic interest, so they won't go against you. So you sit out an issue that may be important because you fear they may try to defeat you in the next election. If we can jump ahead to, Ohio, the obvious thing in the news is the Larry Householder trial.
Sure.
And so that was dark money that came from First Energy, but potentially other sources too. And so straight from a corporation, which you can do after Citizens United. And they gave a little over 60 million to a group controlled by Larry Householder. And he used that money for personal benefit, but he also used it to support Republicans who would support him. So he also tried to knock off some Republican incumbents and to try to get Republicans who would support him for speaker. And so he wins, and he gets some of his supporters in, and they pass a bailout that's going to cost Ohio ratepayers over $1 billion. Now think about it. You only spent 60 million, and you're going to get over $1 billion payoff. That's a very good deal. And you can imagine individual members in Ohio who can't raise those sums of money feel, do I not take a stand here? How do I not get on the wrong side of this so that, these last minute attack ads are being run against me? I just mentioned last month, there was a second article in the Washington Post that last month the Ohio legislature voted that natural gas is a clean energy. And that was by a dark money natural gas group. So groups with deep pockets have the potential there. So if you're sitting there in the state legislature, you have to be a little afraid of them.
Sure. Well, and I mean, I'll bring it up, but I mentioned the train in Northeast Ohio. My reading of an article, and I'm not going to remember the source, but it might have been New York Times, Washington Post, something, suggested that certainly monies that flowed to campaigns could have influenced how strictly people felt we needed to abide by the railroad kinds of regulations, or how hard maybe we push for change that could have made the trains more safe. And so there are braking systems that could work better than the braking systems we have. And had those been required, then perhaps the accident that was encountered there would have been less severe. Doesn't mean it wouldn't have happened, but it maybe would have been less severe. So these are challenges, and I guess we have to, become so much more aware as citizens of the potential for these influences to occur in our democratic system. Important though, go ahead.
Well, and that's also, none of us truly are thinking about railroad braking safety. That's not up there. And so you can imagine how you could shape that policy without a lot of visibility.
Sure.
Those lower level things, now we all care about the clean water and clean air that's going to result from this, but exactly, those kinds of things would fly under the radar of most news coverage. And so it would be easier to shape that.
For sure. And there are lots of times where additional regulations would appear on the surface to say, gosh, they cost more money, but having a tornado roll through, and we see the effects in Florida where some of the properties were up to code with the kinds of safety regulations that the most extreme sorts of restrictions might encounter or encourage, and then other homes that were severely damaged because they didn't meet those standards. And you used the example of Syria as well. So yeah, it's tricky, isn't it? It's complicated, maybe is the way to say that.
Right, yes.
So, all right, organizations are considered people, and that opens the door for the creation of special interest groups or super PACs. And obviously then wealthy donors can direct money to those super PACs, promoting their cause or maybe attacking things that they disagree with. And all of that makes it more difficult for us to know who's really influencing the outcome of our elections. How do your students respond to this? And maybe what should we as citizens be thinking when we come to understand this implication?
Well, before we one of the things we do in class, there's a wonderful site that the Center for Responsive Politics puts together with FEC data, is openSecrets.org. And we get on there just to look at the numbers, because I think something about seeing the numbers makes it real.
Sure.
I just glanced today, and the Ohio Senate race from the fall was well over $100 million. And it just, so we start looking at the scale of the money, because it's hard to get your hands around what's going on. And when you can see the scale of the money, it gives you a better sense of, wow, we're talking tens of millions for a Senate race here, and 10 million for a House race, and $1 billion for a presidential race. It gives you a better sense of the scale of what we're talking about, that, how much money we're talking, how large it is.
And so, all right, the genie is out of the bottle, right? Citizens United and these other things have allowed this money to flow, and so now campaigns become increasingly expensive. It's hard for us to know who and how the influence is being wielded. How do we fix it? Is there any strategy, or are there any conversations about the concerns we might have as it relates to this? And what is it that we can do?
Yeah, that's, I know, you don't want people to walk away saying, I can't do anything. I mean, to really change money in politics would require a constitutional amendment, given the way the Supreme Court has interpreted money in politics, and that's probably not going to happen soon. Right. So, but before we get there, we can require more transparency from groups. Who gave you the money, and to list them. So some states have made it so money that gets spent in the state, you actually can trace the money. And so at a state level, we could require more transparency from groups. At the federal level, the FEC has been problematic for years. It's kind of frozen. It requires a bipartisan group, and so they're paralyzed, and it often takes years to investigate. And so at the federal level, an improved federal election commission, but at the state level, we can require groups to report who spent the money.
So, all right, make sure I understand this. So if we're talking about a local or a state election, we could require certain regulatory expectations. Regulatory is the wrong word. But we could mandate certain transparency. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
But because of the FEC at the federal level, that's not going to happen. So at least to begin, we should begin locally and begin to think about, all right, what are we going to say is acceptable within our own community or within our own state?
Mm-hmm. And it's particularly at the state level, this money goes a long way. Once again, back to the Ohio Senate campaign, once you get over 100 million, most of us can't wrap our head around that amount. But think about how bringing 2 million into Ohio House and Senate races, that money goes a lot further. And so the dark money's here. Mm-hmm. I've gotten flyers from them. And so, I recognize who the group is on it, and I recognize it as a dark money group. So it's here. And so let's let people know who's behind that money.
As it relates to the names of those groups, right? I did a little research through the New York Times, and mm-hmm. some of the nonprofit groups that are aligned with various parties have pretty innocuous names. Yes. America Votes, the Center for Voter Information, or One Nation, the 85 Fund, the 1630 Fund. I mean, these are the names, and they don't sound threatening or problematic, and in some cases, maybe they even sound like, oh gosh, yeah, I want to be part of that, and yet the potential is for them to allow monies that we don't really know where they came from or with what intent.
Yes, it often sounds like good government groups, don't they?
They sound lovely.
Yeah, it sounds like the League of Women Voters. No, I know, they are innocuous names. And trying to identify who's behind them is extremely hard. Yes.
Are there other states that maybe we could turn to that are doing a better job with respect to managing the use of dark money within their local state elections? And maybe
There are. I'm gonna be stumped here. I'm pretty sure California requires more reporting in terms of where that went through, because I'm trying to think of a case that I think it was money that got filtered from Arizona to California or vice versa, and they caught it because one of them had those requirements. And I'm pretty sure it was California, but
okay.
there's 50 different varieties.
Sure.
Yes.
Right. Well, I guess, especially as a member of the league, we're always looking to see what are other states doing that could help us to do what we do better. And from our perspective, we do democracy, and we want to make sure that our democracy is working well for everyone that's involved, and it should involve everyone. So this is challenging stuff, and I guess I'm wondering what else you see, other things that keep you up at night as it relates to the money in politics.
I think that you worry that we don't address certain pressing issues because the money arrayed on that side is so great that they're afraid to take that on. So, for example, this is not dark money, but drug manufacturers spend huge sums of money lobbying. It's legal and they record it, but enormous sums of money. And you wonder, one of the things that has been proposed for years is sort of these costs that meet this other universal standard so that they're still making money. And why has that not been, so you wonder about issues that are kept off the agenda that we don't see because I don't know if they're doing that, but you wonder about economic interests that are keeping some issues off the agenda that are really crucial for people. Drug prices matter and affects people's ability to treat themselves and stay healthy. The energy fight that's going on in Ohio raised lots of interesting questions. So we've already talked about the bailout, but the fact that Ohio is making it very hard for solar and wind energy, but not hard for dirtier forms of energy suggests something. And why would they do that? And what policy priorities have made it possible for counties to vote down clean energy, but not fracking? And
right.
So
I appreciate you mentioning fracking because not everyone thinks about it first, and we don't have a lot of that going on in our immediate region, thankfully, to the benefit of our aquifer, but certainly in the state, there's a great deal of fracking that does go on with negative effects for the environment. So you're right, and yet the lobbyists are establishing that natural gas is green energy when we know what it's doing is also related to some of this less clean sorts of forms.
Well, one more example, if you remember, we raised the gas tax because our roads need to be repaired. Well, they put huge levies on electric vehicles and hybrids, which also seem to shift the cost and make, it seems there are efforts to prevent clean air. And so why would because I think I'm trying to remember the estimate that, the estimate that they would have that it would raise was a fraction of the amount they put on hybrids and electric vehicles. Not electric vehicles because they don't get gas, but hybrids. So lots and lots of small decisions that what motivated that to favor some energy sources over others.
Yeah. You mentioned a resource that I want to make sure I get correct, and I think it was Open Secrets
.org.
.org. Okay.
Yes.
In fact, I looked at that earlier today, although I
Did you?
wasn't looking at
Yeah.
it in the same vein, but I did find that was very useful. So I'm going to go back and I'll use that again. Opensecrets.org. I've got it.
Yeah.
Well,
They comb through federal election data for you and make it manageable. You know, all these things have to do reports, but they make it accessible for voters. And it's a really wonderful resource.
that's great. Are there other resources that you find helpful? We've talked about New York Times, Washington Post, other things, but are there other resources you think you'd like to encourage us to use in our efforts to become better informed citizens?
Well, Open Secrets is my favorite, but actually the Brennan Center, which was a link you sent me initially, they also do a lot, and they're more on the policy side about these are the things we recommend. They do have what some other states are doing. So you can go in there and look up and see what other ones are doing. So I like the Brennan Center a lot too. And they do lots of other issues, but money in elections is one of their issues.
That's great. Well, any last thoughts before we wrap up?
Money affects election. And so a lot of this is happening behind the scenes where it's hard for voters to see what's happening. But if you think about the choices we end up with, they were probably a product of lots of these other things behind the scenes. And so it's very hard for us as voters to know, do I understand what's happening? And do candidates who don't have deep pockets or access to it, can I hear about them? And so if you think about representation and having representatives who have a broader notion of community, money, you become concerned that money may deter some people from running and may advantage others that maybe are not representing the interests of the whole. And it's a concern, it's a concern about representation.
For
at
sure.
its base.
Well, thank you. Today, we've tried to illuminate the impact of dark money, and so hopefully we've at least shed a little bit of light on this topic. I want to thank our guest, Dr. Staci Rhine. She is a professor of political science at Wittenberg University. And I want to thank our viewers, for watching us tonight on League of Women Voters Empowering You. The League of Women Voters encourages everyone to be active as a citizen in our community. This means that we can't be watchers of democracy, we have to be active members of democracy. It includes being educated about government, social policy, and environment, and it starts with being a registered voter, but it doesn't end there. That means we have to actively vote in every election. Democracy is not a spectator sport that we can watch like we watch the Super Bowl on Sunday, but it's something that needs our active engagement. If you need help either registering to vote, learning how to vote, or have ideas for things that you'd like to hear us talk about on this program, you can contact the League by emailing league@lwvdayton.org or by calling our office at 937-228-4041. Thank you for being with us tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.